Well, since this is a little bit more of a kind of intimate family gathering, I thought I'd sit down here and let's just have a little chat. I'm always fortunate on this particular Sunday. The last couple years, it's worked out really well for Paul and Kristen and the other staff to do the Christmas stuff, and then they get to take this week off. And I was like, I think I get the way better deal out of this just from a strict workload here. But I'm also excited. Last year, when I sat here and we talked, we reflected on the last 12 months that we had lived through in 2017 and kind of what we were looking for into 2018. And as I was thinking about what to talk about and share with you all this morning, this resonating theme of hope and what is hope kind of kept coming to mind. But I want to kind of start off a little bit lighter, and I realize that you've already kind of shared a little bit, but I want you to, a little audience participation here, I want you to share with someone next to you, what was the most ambitious New Year's resolution that you've undertaken that you made it, you completed that resolution? Think about that. What was the most ambitious New Year's resolution you made and succeeded at? Go ahead and share that for just a second. Right? So I really like this question because it gets us to think about being ambitious. This idea of what could we accomplish if we really put our mind to it and buckled down and made some things happen, because a lot of it's about discipline and self-control and making things happen. We throw something out there and we say, that's what I want, that's what I'm looking for, and these are the steps that are going to happen to make it. But then when you actually walk those steps and you come to that end, you're like, there's something really satisfying and relieving about that. We're in that season where we're thinking ahead. I want to tell you a little bit about, this is going to kind of feel unrelated, but it'll all come back together. I want to talk to you about some movies that I really loved when I was growing up. And many of you, of course, know about Julie Andrews' Sound of Music. That was always a family favorite of ours. There was also an older book, which I actually loved the book more than the movie, but a book-movie combo called Cheaper by the Dozen. I'm not sure if any of you read that. We probably read it 4 or 5 times through as a family. And then an old Henry Fonda, Lucille Ball movie called Yours, Mine, and Ours. And if you can notice a trend here, there's movies about big families. And I don't know why, but as a kid, I was always really fascinated by big families. You know, I'm the oldest of 6 children, and so there's a part of me that kind of felt understood in these contexts. And a lot of these movies are meant, it's a little zany and it's a little chaos, but something about that made it feel like home to me. I was like, yes, that's what family is. That's what life is. And you have these big moments coming around. And I remember being as young as 7 or 8 years old and dreaming about having a big family of my own. It wasn't daunting to me to have so many brothers and sisters. I'm pretty extroverted and don't need a ton of alone time. So if there's something happening, like I want to be near it, I want to be involved in it. And so I always loved that idea of there just being a ton of life around the house. And I held on to that dream for a really long time. And I remember kind of going through high school and college, and that was really a goal of mine. Like, what do I need to do to start to building a family? And, I watched 3 of my younger siblings get married, and I tried dating, and dating really didn't work. And so I kind of threw myself into missions work and ministry and just believed that eventually something would come about if I let it, and the right thing would come along. But I always just had this postcard in my head of what it looked like around the Christmas tree with me and my family and my siblings and all theirs family. It was just going to get bigger and bigger. And those of you that know my story know that's been a really hard journey through me, for me and my life. And I tried dating women, and that didn't work, and I couldn't figure out how to make it work, but I'd always power through because it was a means to an end, which is a terrible reason to date, right? And But I had this belief, and I just even remember the last relationship that I was in before I started coming out to myself. I remember just like, no, you can do this, and kind of giving myself a pep talk. There's no romance there. There's no, because I wasn't being authentic and true to who God had made me to be. And there was some loss there of, yes, I want companionship, yes, marriage, yes, but it was always there. And I remember actually in that last relationship having this pep talk with myself of, I think I'm willing to fall on my sword for this. Like, I'll take one for the team, which is also a terrible reason to move forward in a relationship. But there was something about that was driving me and motivating me. How can I get this goal? How can I achieve the postcard with all the kids and around the family when there's this step there that I'm missing? So if I can just figure that out, then I can do that. And I remember that relationship coming to an end and me having to start to be really honest. And I'm lucky to have some people in my life that really surrounded me during that time to say, this isn't going to be traditional in any way. But me coming to grips with, oh my God, like, this dream is over. I'm never going to have that. At that point, I hadn't accepted that there could be another way around the mountain, that there could be a provision by God. And I remember for that window of time, just having this loss of, I'm never going to be able to get that. And if I think back to this idea of hope and hopelessness, it was probably that moment in my life where I felt genuinely hopeless. This is never going to happen. I will never be able to get the thing that my heart so desires. And for those of you that celebrated last summer, Aaron and I were able to get married here. I mean, you talk about a story of redemption. We are in the adoption process. If any of you, shameless plug here, if you know of anyone that we could talk to, we already have an agent and a home study done. Like, there's the beginnings and the glimmers of hope that was lost at one point that God is helping us regain. And there's something exciting and impatient and all that stuff, but it's there on the horizon. But going back to kind of that moment, I started thinking about it and writing this, like, what was going on there? And so I started doing a little research, and I found this psychologist named Rick Snyder, who was actually a professor at KU, and he published a series of work in 1994 around a theory that he called hope theory. And what he tried to do in the course of developing this idea is saying, psychologically, what needs to be present? What are the criteria? What's the formula that the things that need to be met and be present for someone to have hope? And by association, what things, if absent, will result in hopelessness? And so he boiled it down into three simple concepts. And he said, you need these three things present for you to have a sense of hope. And the first is goals. You need to actually be able to identify the thing that you want and actually say, that's the horizon, that's point B, and that's where I'm going. The second thing is you need belief and a viable way to get there. So a path, what he called pathways. You need to be able to know that it's possible, and you need to be able to see the road marked out. Even if it's roundabout, you need to find a way to get where you're going to go. And the third thing is what he labeled agency. But you need the motivation and the power and the ability and the circumstances to actually be able to start walking. So it's the movement piece. So you need to know where you're going, you need to know how to get there, and you need to actually have the ability to walk the path that you're given. Goals, pathways, and agency. So I wanted to do this little experiment with you. So I'm going to ask a few things, and these will not be hard questions, but shout out if you can think about it. Let's set up this scenario where you have a 10-year-old child that wants a new video game, the latest video game for Christmas, okay? What is their goal? That's the easy question. Get the video game, right? Christmas morning, open it up, we want the game there. So what pathways, how could this happen? In the mind of a 10-year-old, how could this possibly happen? What are some ideas? Santa could bring it. Good. Parents, grandparents, someone you know could buy it for you. Right? You could earn some money, so you could actually kind of get your way to do it. You could impress the elf on the shelf, because maybe elf on the shelf will put in a good word for you, right? Right? But so you have these, or just at a very simple level, be good. Because, when you're good things that, you're on the list. You got to make the nice list because that makes you eligible then to get the thing that you want, right? So in their mind, there's a bunch of different ways that you can kind of get what you want. And then you have agency. So what actions could our 10-year-old actually do to make this thing happen? Write a letter to Santa Claus, okay? Ask your parents. Make them aware that you know what you want and see if they will get it for you. Good?
Cut a deal with your parents.
Cut a deal. Negotiate. What if I did this? Or what if I got fewer presents, but I got one of them is the one that I want? What if you could actually start kind of thinking through this idea? So you have this shot, and if past experiences have validated that this is possible, so last year they asked for something and got it, there's even a greater chance that they will have hope that what they want can be achieved if they did the work to make it happen. Does that make sense? So we have this whole philosophy of goals, pathways, and agency. Yeah. There you go. Talk dad into wanting the game and how awesome it is. And maybe you don't even have, now that's tricky right there. You're really thinking through this. So as I was thinking about my personal experience with this and thinking about the story of Christ and kind of how do these ideas kind of work together, I started thinking through this phrase, Jesus is the hope of the world. And I began to think through, that's a sentiment that we see it on Christmas cards. Jesus is the hope. He's the reason for the season. But what did that actually mean in gospel times? Because I want you to read, I'm going to read this passage from Isaiah for you on Isaiah chapter 9. I want you to think about what this was the prophecy. So what were people waiting for, and what did they see in Jesus that gave them a realization that he could actually be the hope that they were looking for? So Isaiah chapter 9, 6 and 7 says, "A child is born to us, a son is given to us, and authority will be on his shoulders. He will be named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There will be vast authority and endless peace for David's throne and for his kingdom, establishing it and sustaining it with justice and righteousness now and forever." If you think about Jesus being the hope, if you think about the concept of a Messiah, the message of Jesus is kind of hard to fit in that because what people were looking for was a political revolutionary. People were promised that the oppression that they were living under would one day be liberated by the arrival of a Messiah. And they began to follow him and become intrigued by his ideas because they kept hearing the things that they wanted to hear. They wanted to hear that my kingdom is not of this world. Using words like kingdom, rule, reign, throne, all of that is kind of feeding into this belief of, yes, one day we'll be back on top. One day we will be out from under this regime. We'll have our own empowerment. We'll have our own ability to be autonomous, and we'll be able to drive the car from this point on. Even Judas Iscariot, if you think about it, Judas the Zealot was hoping for the revolution. He saw Jesus being this charming, charismatic leader that people followed. And the more times people followed him in droves, the more hope that he began that one day this is going to be the army that rises up and goes. And there's actually some scholars that believe that Judas's betrayal, his intent was to force Jesus' hand, to force Jesus into taking up arms. And so he actually tried to manipulate the whole environment to get ultimately what he wanted, because I believe that Judas was experiencing a profound amount of disappointment. He saw the goal, he saw the pathway, but Jesus wouldn't walk in it. He wouldn't come into Jerusalem on the white horse, as was tradition. He wouldn't allow his own feet to be washed. He took on the nature of a servant. Towards the end, Judas started seeing again and again and again how this wasn't going according to plan. And so he began to do things that were more desperate. I want to read this passage to you just to kind of give you the bookend. So this is Luke chapter 24, verses 13 to 21. And this is after Jesus has been crucified, and it's in that kind of 3-day period. You'll find out it's right at the end of the 3-day period. We know Jesus has risen from the dead, and so Jesus appears to these two men, and that's where we'll pick it up here in verse 13. But this is what people were thinking post-crucifixion. On that same day, 2 disciples were traveling to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking to each other about everything that had happened. While they were discussing these things, Jesus himself arrived and joined them on the journey. They were prevented from recognizing him. He said to them, "What are you talking about as you walk along?" And they stopped, their faces downcast. And one of them, Cleopas, said, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who is unaware of the things that have taken place here in the last few days?" He said to them, "What things?" They said to him, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth. Because of his powerful deeds and words, he was recognized by God and all the people as a prophet. But our chief priests and our leaders handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped he was the one who would redeem Israel. And all these things happened 3 days ago." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. So Jesus' message is not, if it's not about political revolution, what was it? And does that still make him the hope for all the world? So in a sense, you see that the goal, almost every aspect of this hope formula has had to be revised because the goal has had to change. The goal isn't physical liberation. All of a sudden, Jesus starts telling them the thing that they need and the thing that they focus on, and he begins to describe this concept of hope, describe this concept of redemption, and he's reinforcing it all along the way. And a lot of his messages have to do with it. Your circumstances aren't the things that decide whether or not you have hope. Your environment doesn't get to decide if you are hopeful or hopeless. There's something inside you that wants more, wants something different. I wrote this down. Hope isn't contingent on your circumstances, but that doesn't make it easy. At the same time, Jesus did bring an incredible amount of hope to the world around him because he touched people who were hopeless. You think about the lepers, the people that had no promise that they were ever going to recover. They were outcasts of society, and all of a sudden, Jesus introduces this idea of you have worth and value and a purpose and a role to play in the world. All of a sudden, these goal-less people have a reason for moving on. They have a pathway. They have the physical ability to move down that path. Women, especially those that were persecuted and oppressed and taken advantage of, all of a sudden he says, you have value, you matter, and you have a reason to be here. These people don't condemn you, neither do I. Jesus says to the woman that was caught in the act of adultery that they were going to stone, he says, that doesn't define you. You have something greater to live for. Jesus begins to introduce this idea of how to have hope, how to live with this new idea, and it's not just political revolution. And it seemed like the people that were able to encounter Jesus close up were the ones that got it, and the ones that kind of understood that. It was the religious leaders, the political leaders, the people in power that had the hardest time with this because they had things to protect, and they had things to orchestrate, and they had things to defend. And yet Jesus goes to people and he says, you matter. This isn't about whether or not you're liberated. This is about what you decide to look at for your role in your life, and you have value because you are loved. Because God, your Father, God, your Mother, loves you. And it truly is a revolutionary thought. So Jesus showing up and being born and being worshipped by the angels and the shepherds and visited by the magi, the kings from the east, they believed him to be the hope, but I wonder if they really understood at that point what that meant. And maybe they understood something that we didn't, or maybe they discovered something that we didn't. The truth is that some of us have a much easier time having hope than others. If you think about what hopelessness looks like in our world, people who don't have a point B, don't have a possibility of where life is going, or can't see a way around issues of money or issues of loneliness or issues of depression, and they can't necessarily even get the motivation that these things, the circumstances, the world around us prevents them from walking down the journey that they want. There's a lot of reasons to lose hope. And in 2015, a study was done with 7,500 subjects, and they found overwhelmingly that loneliness and social isolation resulted in an average 30% increase in heart disease and stroke. This idea of hopelessness and somehow loneliness and being left to ourselves can contribute to this feeling of not being able to go where you need to go. There's a psychologist named Aaron Beck who'd actually developed a 20-question test that psychologists use, and it's yes or no questions like, I look forward to a future with hope and enthusiasm. I just can't cut the brakes, and there's no reason I will in the future. Yes or no. I don't expect to get what I really want. Yes or no. And according to his scoring scale, if you answer no to half of them, then you're moving into a moderate to severe form of hopelessness. This idea of dreaming about the future, about knowing who's going to be around you and who's going to be there and being able to get the things that you want is part of how we overcome some of these things. When we are isolated and alone, those are the times when it's the hardest for us to keep up hope. Because as we think about what happened after Jesus went to heaven and he left the disciples and the apostles entrusted with the world around them, you begin to see over the next part of the saga and the very beginning of Acts and the development of the early church that people start to pick up on this wasn't about a revolution. They didn't pick up arms and armies didn't storm on his behalf. And all of a sudden these people come together. And in Acts chapter 2, it describes the people that finally started to figure out what this message of hope was. And in Acts chapter 2, it says, the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to their community, to their shared meals, and to their prayers. A sense of awe came over everyone, and God performed many wonders and signs through the apostles. All the believers were united and shared everything. They would sell pieces of property and possessions and distribute the proceeds to everyone who needed them. Every day they met together in the temple and ate in their homes. They shared food with gladness and simplicity. They praised God and demonstrated God's own goodness to everyone. And the Lord added to the community those who were being saved. And I tell you, as you think about this formula, the piece that I feel like is missing is who is around you. Over the course of this season, there's as much loneliness as there is joy and community. And what I love about this church is how they're wide arms. They're wide arms for people to be able to come in, to belong, to be a part of things going on, not just around Christmas, but all throughout the year. You have to know where you're going and how to get there and the motivation to go, but you need us around. And so I think about the statement, Jesus is the hope of the world. Okay, but Jesus is the hope of the world because he lets us be the hope of the world. There's something about how we address these threats to us living in hope, and a lot of it is us coming together. And I love how the early church began to understand and unpack and have that aha moment of what was Jesus actually representing here. And all of a sudden, Jesus is the hope of the world, and we began to see this. So I want you to think about going into next year. I want you to think about resolutions, if you write them down, or you think about the things you want to achieve, or the books you want to read, or the places you want to go, or the things that you want to work towards. And I want you to think about how much hope you have. So we started off our conversation by saying, tell me about the ambitious New Year's resolution that you had. Whether it's ambitious or mundane, there's something about looking ahead to next year to say, do you have hope? Do you have hope that you had? If you don't, what's missing? Can you begin to dissect and figure out what's missing in this journey that you have? And finally, I want you to think about someone that might be struggling with hope, might be a little hopeless, and see if you can figure out what's missing there. And then what role do you play in that? How are we the hope of the world? Because of this love of Jesus Christ that we've experienced, this aha moment that we've had of what Jesus' presence and love, forgiveness, joy, all these messages of wisdom, what he called us as the body of Christ to do. Because I think that he is the hope of the world, and I think that makes us the hope of the world. And as we move into next year, I am hopeful. And I say that because it's been hard-fought hope. It's not necessarily easier, but it's so good. And I'm so grateful to be here in this space to be able to have hope with all of you. We're going to move on and reflect a little bit. But I want you to think about kind of where we're going. As we start back next week and the busyness is going to hit back in. But let's just take a moment, reflect, and look a little forward.